By the way, this was me on the airplane this morning. What can I say? You know, I kind of like my privacy, and it's very important to me. All right, so when it comes to the wearables and the Internet of Things, there are a number of benefits and drawbacks. And certainly there's a lot of benefits of these devices in terms of the data that they supply, but there's always some issues as well. The issue is that the ubiquitous connected sensors and devices provide that continuous and constant recording and transmitting and sending of data. Now, I don't know about you, that sounds great if you're on the product development side, but if you're on the consumer side, that can be a little bit nerve-wracking. Now, how are they going to use this kind of information on the enterprise side? Well, they're going to use this opportunity to generate a detailed view of the customer profile to improve marketing campaigns and to be able to engender increased revenue through targeted advertising, for instance. But though wearables and IoT are similar in terms of privacy concerns to that of mobile devices, the nature of the continuous and on-the-body and the ubiquitous environmental sensing brings entirely new heightened concerns about privacy. The unfortunate fact facing most of the companies is that when it comes to wearables and IoT devices, they're truly not secure for the most part. In fact, it's difficult to even keep up with the evolving security needs of technology, much less the protection of these massive amounts of data that's being gathered through IoT devices and wearable devices. Moreover, all of this presents an attractive target for data theft and misuse. Now, this title of this presentation is a little bit misleading because it does exactly what I don't like, which is, in the public, mainstream typically commingles the notion of privacy and security as one topic. And frankly, they deserve dedicated dialogue, and they're very different in nature. So what I wanted to do today was focus primarily on the privacy side of the equation for today. Now let's talk about some of the major consumer privacy concerns. Researchers Modi and Kane highlight the following privacy issues when it comes to wearable data. First is, do people really understand the social implication, the lack of awareness in terms of the impact on privacy to others? And what are the possible implications of allowing others to track your location at all hours of day and night? And how would you like some of your private, discrete, confidential information displayed on social media or on a wearable device or an IoT device? And what about the lack of access control? In terms of consumers really don't fundamentally have control of their own data. So the data ownership issue is a big issue here. Then there's the surveillance and the sousveillance. And people are concerned about outside intrusion into their daily lives through monitoring. And these types of monitoring are typically associated with malicious intent. I mean, just yesterday, I was being interviewed by a media organization, and they were asking me about my reaction to Amazon's updated announcement about their drone delivery service. One of the questions that they specifically asked me was, what is the impact of surveillance and sousveillance on the people down below as these drones, fleets of drones, cover the metro area? Privacy concerns for head-mounted devices such as AR and VR headsets. Now, this is related to the first issue in terms of the lack of awareness on the impact of privacy. But it's also a particular concern in terms of the ability for it to be able to actually detect faces. So let's think about Google Glass as an example. And this leads us to facial recognition. Now, we know that in the military, for example, they're using AR and VR glasses to be able to detect and identify terrorist profiles instantaneously. That also leads to speech disclosure, which is highly regulated. Can you imagine every word that's spoken being recorded without your knowledge to be able to potentially used against you at some point. Surreptitious audio and video recording, meaning there's a lack of consent as it relates to the lack of data control. Automatic synchronization with their social media. We all love emojis, we all love social media, but how would you like it if these IoT devices in your home, your car, capture things about you and then automatically share out on Twitter, Instagram, Pinterest? Right to forget. In other words, individuals should have the right to have certain data or internet records about you be deleted at some point so that third parties can't no longer trace you or find you or that information about you, such as a criminal record perhaps. Well, personally, I think the biggest concern that I see is that wives will be able to read their husbands' minds. So the next time she asks you and looks you in the eye and says, and she's, by the way, wearing dress 2 sizes too small, there's no getting around to telling the truth. And likewise for men who love to flex their muscles in the mirror, there's finally going to be able to know for sure that their wives actually know that their belly is mightier than their arms. So how are we as startups and enterprises to move confidently in terms of addressing some of these privacy concerns? Well, certainly the clearest path forward in terms of effectively managing data privacy concerns is actually head-on, it's directly. And consider privacy as one of the key aspects of doing business. And privacy should be part of the leadership directives, the company culture, and the brand image and the reputation in terms of what you actually espouse to the marketplace. And it should be implemented throughout the organization. And protecting privacy differentiates a company and helps that organization to move towards not just compliance, but towards market leadership. Privacy should be a foundational tenet of every enterprise, especially as wearable and IoT advance into every aspect of our lives. And leadership needs to develop a comprehensive approach and strategy for implementing privacy at every levels of the organization. And businesses, even the startups, need to think about how do they articulate in terms of their privacy advocacy, in terms of controlling and managing their consumer, employee, as well as corporate data securely and sagaciously. Now, one of the frameworks that we can look to is a framework called privacy by design. Because we all know that talk is cheap, but a strong commitment requires action. And that means implementing secure measures at every stage of the data management lifecycle. And it's been developed by Dr. Ann Kavokian. I had a chance to meet her last year in Toronto, Canada. And she was the former Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario. Now, she stresses 7 principles within her framework. One is the proactive, not reactive principle, which means that we need to focus on being proactive, not remedial. Privacy as a default setting, meaning it's a mindset. It's just something that you live with and breathe every day. Privacy embedded into design. Implementing privacy after the fact is much harder than starting from the design stage. Just ask some of the larger enterprises. Full functionality, positive sum, not zero sum. See, sometimes we think that when we have to make these choices, that it's a win-lose situation, but in fact it's not. It's not that type of game theory. It can actually have a win-win scenario and actually bolster the corporate financials and the initiatives while still putting the customer's privacy and their values as a high priority. End-to-end security. Even the panel before and then the previous sessions talked about the need for end-to-end security because it only takes one backdoor to put the entire system at risk. Visibility and transparency. We need to keep it open and allow customers to especially manage their data. One of the things I'm going to talk about is this notion of data vaults. And finally, respect for user privacy. Keep it user-centric. One of the best ways to actually put this into motion, even if you're a startup, is to identify and dedicate a particular role. And if you're a larger enterprise, it may be even a division or department. It helps to create and empower a chief privacy officer. And creating this position and this department, what it does is it allows for you to be able to focus on privacy matters, and it makes a very bold statement and a commitment to protecting your customers' privacy. The creation of the department actually enhances a number of things. One is that the department can solely focus on the privacy needs. Two, it shows that employees value privacy as well, including their own data. And third, it creates a positive view of the company in the eyes of the public. And by the way, it helps if you grant the CPO superpowers, because employees are more likely to listen and comply. So let's talk about industry self-regulation. One of the best ways to ensure data privacy standards is actually to work with others in the industry. Nothing like self-regulation. Companies involved in IoT and wearables are uniquely positioned to have a powerful impact in the direction of the privacy standards, because it's happening now. This is it. Now, there are a number of industry organizations that you're seeing here that support interoperability, standardization, protection, and advancement. Many of the speakers here represent some of those members as well. By supporting and becoming involved in some of these initiatives, consortiums, and alliances, the startups and enterprises can ensure that they're not only in compliance with the law, but they're also truly affording customers the best in data privacy and security. Frankly, we're not going to be able to solve this by ourselves. Moreover, especially if you're a startup, the worst thing you can do is to start from scratch. There's a standard out there, or a set of standards. So let's talk about a few of them. The All-Scene Alliance, which we are a member of, is one of the largest groups in terms of consortiums. And the framework that they use is called AllJoin. And its members include Microsoft, Qualcomm, I saw, is represented today, Sony, ADT, AT&T, Cisco, and Honeywell, as an example. The Open Interconnect Consortium is dedicated to the principles of open source standardization. Its board of directors and the representatives include Samsung, Intel, Cisco, and GE. And by the way, as I describe some of these, you'll notice that the same companies are in many of these standards, because even they themselves really don't know which one's going to converge onto. Industrial Internet Consortium is another nonprofit consortium that targets the framework and direction for IoT devices. So you have leaders such as AT&T, Cisco, GE, and IBM. OASIS, which was supported by Microsoft and IBM, supports a broad range of companies, such as Adobe, Boeing, and even the government. Eclipse Foundation, very prolific with their projects, is working on creating a number of frameworks for IoT. And you have large players like Google, IBM, Oracle, and SAP. So let's talk about privacy policy. We all have it, but is it the right level? Is it inclusive beyond just mobile, but actually takes into consideration the sensitivity of wearables and IoT? In order to get the most out of privacy policies, the policy has to be easy to understand and needs to include several levels that clarify and add details about the enterprise, as well as the consumer's rights and responsibilities. The policies should explain exactly the types of data that's being gathered from these devices and indicate the reason for the data collection. How is that data being used? Who will have access to it? And how long will it be stored? All needs to be included in the policy. And then in terms of the presentation, you have to take a cascading approach where you have at the highest level very short, simplified language for consumers. And if they're interested, they can drill down deeper and deeper to eventually the legalese. Data storage and management has to take into consideration a variety of solutions. One of those happens to be data anonymization, which is really about stripping and encrypting the identifying data, which in concept makes the storage of that data much safer. So most of us are familiar with PII requirements, for instance. Well, now, that sounds conceptually enticing, but research indicates that data thieves can construct your profile using just a handful of data points, some of which can be available publicly. Hence, data anonymization in isolation isn't sufficient. A way to protect your customer's identity. We need an arsenal. And one of those arsenals, of course, is data minimization. Data minimization refers to only getting and using exactly the type of data needed to effectively provide a particular service or product. And that data should be removed after it's served its purpose. Now, this actually requires a fine balance because, well, you want to collect the minimum amount of data, but you also need to make sure that it's not adversely affecting your product or service offering, and certainly the future roadmap. Data vault, one of my favorite topics. It's one of probably the best ways to give control back to the consumers because, frankly, it's their data. It was never ours to begin with. Now, the data vaults, though they're not legally mandated yet, the industry is really pushing the data brokers and the third parties to make data vaults available to consumers because you need to know who's touching your data and what are they doing with it. That gives consumers granular preference management over the type of data, how it's stored, how it's used, instead of making these types of options all or nothing propositions. And data collection and usage should fuel the business model as well as protect consumers. A product needs to be able to strive to find that sweet spot of giving consumers meaningful notice and choice over their data without limiting the core functionality of the product or service. Very important balance, tough to do. Local data storage. One trend that we're seeing, especially on the wearables and connected home side, is this notion of local data storage. Users of local data storage can securely access and manage their information without sharing everything out onto the cloud or with proprietary service providers. And one of the areas that we're seeing is the home automation hub is becoming quickly that local data storage. For instance, we're seeing home controller hubs that enable homeowners to monitor their home's temperature, their lighting, their energy use, perhaps even information from wearables on the body. But some even have capabilities to be able to process offline for faster performance and to offer added privacy and security layers. And that collected data from the devices and the environment, the location resides locally on the hub and gives the user control over that data. Now, what's interesting is that you have a lot of players, and I think we had eye control networks today. SmartThings, Revolve, Lutron, and others, including the traditional ones like EMC, Western Digital, SanDisk, and Cisco, recognizing that one of the exciting fields is the new personal data center at home or on their body for those who choose to have complete control over their data. So in conclusion, privacy and security framework for mobile is no longer sufficient. IoT and wearables are pushing the boundary in terms of privacy and security much further. And enterprises and startups need to engage privacy directly through concerted leadership directives. And it starts with designing and implementing a corporate culture, right? That breeds a certain value system, that gets people involved in instituting best practices described in this presentation. So in short, lead with privacy. Thank you. So, questions?
Are noble, but it also seems that they are in conflict with principles in other fields. So for example, data minimization. We're told we're supposed to capture every bit of data we possibly can about our customers, even if we don't know what we're going to use it for yet. And that, is different from what you're suggesting. So it seems like within business there's, in several cases, you're espousing one thing which is noble, but we're often told other things for other business reasons.
Great question. So one of the things is we've actually partnered with IBM and IBM Watson. So I had a chance to speak at IBM Amplify Insight, and then next week in Germany with their opening of IoT Watson Center in Munich. one of the things that's from a practical purpose is that enterprises are starting to recognize is you don't want to collect every possible data from every devices. It is not necessarily right, because what you're essentially doing is you're creating a massive dark data lake of dark data. Moreover, first and foremost, before you start to just suck in all sorts of data and figure out what you need, you have to have a data strategy in place. So for example, when I spoke at Razorfish in New York, I had a chance to meet with one of the leading data scientists that specialize in AI. Her recommendation to the audience that are using AI machine learning was that you have to first and foremost understand what are you doing. That will then help dictate the kind of data that you need to source versus taking all of it. It is, if you're in the IT data warehousing, it is a headache that's going to be created. We know that startups right now that are on the IoT platform space, one of the things that they're working on is this notion of data cleansing even before it comes into the cloud. So Chimera IoT as an example, and others, are trying to figure out how do we start to use the computing edge and the capabilities that's going to get increased over time to do a lot of the calculations, some of the cleansing, so that you're not just pulling in all sorts of garbage into the cloud. So to your point, I think what I want to provide is something practical, especially for startups. It's very difficult with finite resources to have to tackle privacy. But if they don't, you're basically opening yourself up for a ton of issues, including obfuscation as an example. If you take a look at some of the source code of a lot of the startups, it's very easy to deconstruct, very easy to find holes. And when you talk about end-to-end security, you have to make sure it starts everywhere from the hardware stack to the transmission, the network layer, the cloud, the API services of third party. It's massive. So practices, and this is not just conceptual, it has to be practical. One last question, please.
Yeah, the Five Eyes intelligence agencies collected all worldwide, sorted out later. They're pretty effective.
Thank you for your comment. And yes, we do talk to Homeland Securities. One more question? Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.